Hello to everyone tuning in. Just a quick start. It's a fun idea if you share where you're listening from. Thanks, like and subscribe, and let's get comfortable and start the fun. My life with Emily was, for a long time, the kind of life people envy. We had it all, so it seemed. A decade of marriage had established a comfortable rhythm between us. There were weekend brunches with friends, evening walks after dinner, and the occasional spontaneous getaway that kept our relationship alive. We had a solid home, shared inside jokes, and a deep sense of companionship that, from the outside, appeared unshakable. The kind of life anyone would expect from a couple who had weathered life's storms together. The kind of life I once believed we had. It's funny how easy it is to settle into complacency when everything seems perfect. I never thought much about the details that make up the fabric of a marriage. The looks, the gestures, the habits. But when things started to shift, they were subtle. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I noticed Emily had become distracted. It began innocently enough. A missed dinner here, a sudden work trip there. She'd started coming home later than usual, citing back-to-back meetings or last-minute work crises. At first, I didn't question it. After all, she was ambitious, and her career was taking off. It wasn't until the discrepancies started to add up that I began to feel that tightening in my chest, that slow creeping sense that something wasn't right. She began spending more time on her phone, texting late into the night. I remember the flicker of the screen glowing in our dark bedroom, her face bathed in that cold blue light. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. Just work stuff, she said. I let it go. I trusted her, didn't I? Trust was the cornerstone of our relationship, and I wasn't about to undermine that over a few texts. But the feeling remained. I found myself replaying our interactions in my mind, searching for signs, trying to understand when things had started to change. When had the warmth between us turned into something cooler, more distant? I'm not the type to jump to conclusions. I've always been a man of logic and reason. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was letting paranoia creep into what was otherwise a strong, stable marriage. But the odd behavior continued, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was a new edge to her interactions with me, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. She started making more of an effort with her appearance, dressing up for work like she used to when we first met. I complimented her, thinking it was just part of her professional success. But the nagging suspicion in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. It was little things at first. She'd take her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom. The dinners we used to enjoy together felt forced. The conversations stilted. There was always a reason for her absence. Work deadlines, meetings that ran late, client dinners that required her attention. I noticed how she'd stopped laughing at my jokes, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. I rationalized it all, trying to push the doubt down, telling myself that this was just a rough patch, that things would get better. But deep down, I knew. I knew something had changed between us, something irreparable. It wasn't until one particular evening, when I saw her return home later than expected with a hurried excuse, that I realized I was no longer merely confused. I was suspicious. She had a glow about her, the kind of radiance I hadn't seen in years, and it wasn't for me. The connection between us had grown thinner, stretched to the point where I could almost see through it, and I could feel myself slipping out of the frame of her life. And that's when I made my decision. I had to know for sure. I couldn't confront her yet, not without understanding the full scope of what was happening. I wasn't going to be a fool who accused his wife of infidelity without evidence. I was going to be smarter than that. I would gather the truth piece by piece, and then, only then, would I act. I've never been a man ruled by emotion. My strength has always been in my ability to control it, to channel it into something more productive. This time would be no different. If Emily had betrayed me, I would not react with anger or tears. I would make sure that she regretted it in ways she couldn't even imagine yet. This wasn't about rage. It wasn't even about her. It was about me taking back control of a life I had built, a life I wasn't about to let anyone, least of all my own wife, tear apart. And so I waited, quietly watching, knowing that whatever was coming, I would be ready for it. The next step was mine to take. It was a Friday evening when I found the receipt. I hadn't been looking for anything. Emily had been rushing out the door that morning, late for another one of her client meetings, and she'd forgotten her work bag at home. It wasn't unusual for me to tidy up after her. I'd always been the more organized one in the relationship. So I picked up the bag from the hallway, intending to set it aside, but as I did, a slip of paper poked out from the side pocket, almost begging for my attention. I wasn't the type to pry, at least I hadn't been before, but there was something about the way it stuck out, something insistent in that moment. Without thinking, I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a hotel receipt dated 2 days ago for a suite at a place I knew well, a boutique hotel just outside the city. The kind of place where you go to disappear for a while, not for a meeting, certainly not for work. The sight of it made my stomach drop. 2 days ago, Emily had told me she was stuck in back-to-back meetings downtown. She'd even called me to say she was sorry for being home so late, her voice calm and apologetic. But now I was holding proof that she had been somewhere else entirely. I sat down on the couch, the receipt in my hand. My mind raced, but my face betrayed nothing. Years of control had prepared me for this moment, though I hadn't known it at the time. The emotions came, uninvited but inevitable. Anger, disbelief, hurt. I felt them all in a sharp, gut-wrenching wave, but I didn't let them control me. No, I couldn't afford to be driven by emotion now. What I needed was clarity. The pieces began to fall into place with a cruel kind of logic. Emily's late nights, her sudden interest in her appearance, the way she would turn her phone screen away from me when a message came in. I'd ignored the signs, trusting her, trusting our life together. I thought I knew her. I thought our marriage was strong. But in that moment, it became clear that there was another life she'd been living, one that I wasn't part of. I wanted to confront her right then. I wanted to throw the receipt in her face and demand answers, but that would have been too easy for her, too simple. It would have given her the power to twist the narrative, to make excuses, to cry and apologize, to shift the blame. No, I wasn't going to give her that chance. I wasn't going to be the one caught off guard. Instead, I took a deep breath and folded the receipt neatly back into her bag, exactly where I found it. Nothing in my demeanor would change, not yet. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make her feel every ounce of betrayal she had inflicted on me, but in a way that would leave her grasping for air, without a lifeline to cling to. I would dismantle the world she'd taken for granted piece by piece, without her knowing until it was too late. That night, I cooked dinner as usual. Emily came home late, her smile apologetic but distracted. She kissed me on the cheek, the same rehearsed affection I'd been accustomed to, and I played my part just as well. We ate, we talked, and I asked her about her day, the way I always did. She told me about meetings, clients, and deadlines, her lies slipping out with ease. I nodded and listened, my face composed, my mind elsewhere. When she went to bed, exhausted as she often seemed these days, I stayed awake in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. My thoughts were cold and methodical, calculating. I couldn't just accuse her. That would put me on the defensive, and I needed to be in control. I had to know more. I needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal before I made my move. The next day, I set my plan in motion. I started with her phone, something I'd never considered invading before. Emily had always been protective of it, but not in a way that raised alarms. Now I realized how deliberately she'd kept it away from me. While she showered, I unlocked it using the passcode I'd memorized months ago, back when it hadn't seemed to matter. What I found confirmed everything I already suspected. There were messages hidden under a different contact name, Marie from work. But Marie was Mark, one of her colleagues, someone she'd mentioned casually in conversation over the past few months. They were careful in their texts, using codes and vague language, but it didn't take long to piece together the truth. Emily had been meeting him regularly. Their affair wasn't new, it had been going on for months, maybe longer. I saved screenshots of everything, quietly documenting the evidence I'd need for later. I didn't want just the knowledge of her infidelity. I wanted proof that I could use to destroy her life in the same way she destroyed mine. But not all at once. No, this would be slow, painful, precise. The next step was simple: observation. I had to learn more about her routines, her habits. I began tracking her movements without her noticing. I'd wait for her to leave for one of her so-called work meetings and then follow her. I watched as she drove to the hotel where she met him, slipping inside like they were doing nothing wrong. I noted the time she spent there, the way she carried herself when she came out, a different kind of glow in her eyes. She thought she was clever, but she was predictable. Too predictable. In the days that followed, I continued to gather evidence, quietly watching her spiral into her own web of deceit. I said nothing, did nothing out of the ordinary. I still kissed her goodbye in the morning, made her coffee, pretended everything was the same. But each interaction felt like a performance, a script I was no longer invested in. Inside, I was planning, calculating. Each day brought me closer to the moment when I would pull the rug out from under her feet. I needed to know every angle, every detail of her affair before I could execute the next phase. And then, just as the pieces started to fall into place, I found the final confirmation: an email. It was buried in a hidden folder on her computer, a message from Mark confirming their weekend getaway at a remote cabin in the mountains. This was it, the indisputable proof. It was scheduled for the following weekend, 2 days away. I had everything I needed now, but I didn't feel satisfaction. Not yet. The discovery wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. My mind was no longer occupied with disbelief or shock. Instead, I felt a cold certainty. I wasn't going to confront her about this trip. No, I would let her go, let her think she had the upper hand. Let her enjoy her weekend away with him, ignorant of the storm that was about to hit her when she returned. In 2 days, Emily would leave for her rendezvous with Mark, blissfully unaware that her entire life was about to be turned upside down. And when she came back, she would find everything in ruins, just as she had left me. But not yet. I had more work to do, more pieces to put in place. I slipped into the role of a loving husband with ease. It wasn't difficult. I'd been playing it for years. The key was not to overdo it, to stay just as attentive as I always had been, maybe even a little more. It was essential to maintain the illusion that I was clueless, that I hadn't the faintest idea what was going on behind my back. Emily would never suspect. She'd grown comfortable in her deceit, and I needed her to remain that way. I needed her confident enough to keep making mistakes while I observed. The first step was gathering evidence. Sure, I already knew about Mark and the affair, but I needed more. I needed to understand the scope of her lies, her movements, her patterns. I wanted to know every detail, not just for my own satisfaction, but to ensure that when the time came, I would have everything I needed to tear her world apart. Emily's phone was the gateway to most of it. She kept it close but not close enough, and I had access to everything now. Her messages with Mark were frequent but careful, always under a different name. It was laughable, really. She thought she was being even masking his contact information under Marie from work, but their conversations were filled with innuendos, thinly veiled plans, and shared memories from encounters I hadn't even suspected. I took screenshots of everything, saving the messages in a separate folder on my own devices, ensuring I had a copy of every incriminating detail. There was no need to rush. This wasn't a time for an emotional confrontation. I needed her to feel safe, to believe that her secrets were still hers to keep. Beyond the messages, I started tracking her movements more closely. I used a GPS tracker, an easy addition to her car that she'd never notice. It allowed me to monitor her without being physically present, and it was invaluable. I'd already followed her to one of her hotel rendezvous with Mark, but now I had proof of every visit, every deviation from her regular schedule. The more I learned, the more methodical I became. Emily's routines began to look more and more predictable. She would always leave the house at the same time on the days she planned to meet him. Their little affairs were well orchestrated, planned out in advance, and I had all the dates in my calendar marked quietly in my head. I let her have her freedom, let her sink deeper into the illusion that I was oblivious. Each time she left for these work trips, I smiled inwardly, knowing that my silence would crush her later, far more effectively than any immediate confrontation. I continued to act normal, too normal maybe. Dinners were cooked, conversations kept light and friendly, but there was a growing distance between us that I could feel, a gap that widened with each passing day. Emily must have noticed it, but I kept it subtle. She was likely attributing the shift to her own guilt, convinced that her secret life was what made us drift apart. And in a way, she was right, but not in the way she thought. As I accumulated more evidence, I started testing small acts of sabotage, nothing too overt yet. I needed to understand the effect of my actions on her, how she would react, how easily her carefully constructed life could start unraveling. The first thing I did was plant subtle doubts in her mind. I deleted a few emails from her work account, important ones that she had been waiting for, and watched her panic as she tried to recover them. She'd sit at the dining table, her brows furrowed, muttering to herself, blaming technology. I'd offer to help, a supportive husband concerned about her stress, and watch as her frustration grew. Next, I began moving things around in the house. It was simple at first, shifting small objects, her keys, her phone charger, her planner. It wasn't enough for her to suspect anyone was behind it, just enough to make her question herself. I'd find her standing in the living room, staring blankly at the table where she swore she'd left her keys, before finally concluding that she must have been careless. The stress began to build, but still she couldn't connect the dots. There were also the little missteps at work, which I enjoyed the most. I had access to her work emails, so I began to sabotage her projects ever so slightly. A missing attachment here, a miscommunicated deadline there. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to create tension with her colleagues and boss. I overheard one of her phone calls where she was apologizing profusely for a missed deadline that she swore she had communicated. But of course, she hadn't. Not anymore. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, with the same calm exterior I'd always had. Every minor inconvenience stacked up, slowly building pressure in her life. She began to snap at little things, venting her frustration over seemingly trivial matters. I pretended to be the understanding husband, listening to her complaints, offering comforting words. But inside, I relished every moment of her unraveling. It was slow, methodical, and utterly satisfying. I didn't need to rush. I didn't want her life to fall apart all at once. That would be too easy. No, I wanted it to collapse piece by piece, crumbling slowly under the weight of her own choices. The beauty of it was in the subtleties. As her stress mounted, her relationship with Mark began to show cracks. They were no longer the carefree lovers who stole hours in hotel rooms. Their conversations became more strained, filled with Emily's complaints about her life falling apart. I read through her messages to him, feeling a cold satisfaction as she poured out her frustrations. "I can't seem to catch a break," one message read. "Everything is going wrong all at once. Work is a disaster. Home feels off. I don't know what's happening, Mark. I feel like I'm losing my mind." Good. That was exactly what I wanted. Mark's responses were what I expected. Reassurances that things would get better, that she just needed a break. But I could sense his own patience wearing thin. Emily's problems were starting to bleed into their secret relationship, tainting the fantasy of what they had. I watched with amusement as their connection began to fracture under the weight of her unraveling life. And yet, I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I began escalating my actions, always careful, always subtle. I made an anonymous complaint to her boss, claiming to be a colleague who had concerns about her recent performance. It wasn't much, just a hint of doubt planted in the right mind, but it was enough to spark a more serious conversation at work. I overheard her venting about it to Mark over the phone, her voice cracking with the strain. "They think I'm distracted, that I'm not giving enough to my projects. I swear, Mark, it's like everything is slipping through my fingers." Mark's responses grew more distant, more obligatory. He was losing interest. I could see it happening, and it was only a matter of time before he would start to pull away. He wasn't in this for the long haul. He wasn't going to be there to pick up the pieces when everything collapsed. As for Emily, her paranoia started to creep in. I noticed her becoming more obsessive about little things, checking her phone constantly, double-checking her emails, rereading messages, and confirming plans. She was beginning to suspect that something was wrong, but she still hadn't connected it to me. How could she? In her mind, I was still the devoted husband, the man who stood by her while her world crumbled. The tension between us grew in ways she couldn't articulate. She would look at me sometimes as if searching for something, reassurance, comfort, maybe even guilt. But I gave her none of that. I played my role perfectly, staying supportive but distant enough to let her feel the growing chasm between us. She was isolated, trapped in her own web of lies and deceit, and I was tightening the strings around her without her even realizing it. As her affair with Mark began to strain, she leaned into me more, out of desperation rather than affection. She needed stability, and in some twisted way, she saw me as the one constant in her life. It was ironic, really. The very thing she had betrayed was now the one thing she clung to as her world spun out of control. I let her. It was part of the plan, part of the final act I was building toward. But I had to be careful not to overplay my hand. She was nearing her breaking point, and I needed to time everything just right. I couldn't rush the finale. It had to be perfect, complete. And so I continued my quiet investigation, continued my sabotage, watching as Emily's carefully constructed life slowly disintegrated around her. She still didn't know what was happening. She was lost in the chaos, too distracted by her own unraveling to notice the hand that was pulling the strings. I wasn't finished yet, not even close. The final steps were coming, and when they did, she would never see it coming. I would make sure of that. The first cracks were subtle. Emily hadn't noticed them at first, but I had. The small ways in which her life began to fray, the tiniest missteps, the overlooked details that, one by one, would build into something much larger. My actions, measured and deliberate, were too faint to draw suspicion, but strong enough to disrupt her daily routine. I'd done my research carefully, analyzing her habits, her social circles, her career, everything she valued. I was learning how to dismantle it all, bit by bit, without her ever realizing who was behind the scenes pulling the strings. The first act of sabotage was almost laughable in its simplicity. I deleted a single crucial work email from her inbox. It was for a meeting she'd spent weeks preparing for, a presentation to the senior executives that could determine the next phase of her career. Without the attachment she needed, Emily was caught off guard in the meeting, forced to scramble for a solution in front of her peers and superiors. She didn't fail outright, but she faltered, and in her world, where appearances were everything, that small misstep was a seed of doubt. When she came home that night, her frustration was palpable. She dropped her purse on the floor, rubbing her temples. I asked her how the day had gone, maintaining the facade of the supportive husband. Her voice wavered as she explained how things had gone wrong, how she couldn't figure out why the file wasn't there. I could tell she was trying to calm herself down, rationalize it as a one-time mistake. I listened attentively, nodded in the right places, and reassured her that everyone makes mistakes. But I knew she wouldn't let it go. The uncertainty would linger. I needed to escalate, but in ways she wouldn't connect to me. The next step was her social circle, Emily's carefully curated group of friends and colleagues. Most of them admired her, seeing her as the ambitious, driven woman who had everything under control. But admiration could easily sour into envy with the right push. I began planting anonymous seeds of doubt in her closest relationships, carefully crafted messages that seemed to come from nowhere. It started with a simple message to one of her colleagues, someone who had always been competitive with her. "Did you know Emily's been seeing Mark? It's none of my business, but people are starting to talk." That was all it took. I knew how office gossip worked. Rumors spread like wildfire, and once they took root, there was no stopping them. Emily would be oblivious at first, but as the whispers grew louder, she would start to sense the change in the way her colleagues looked at her. Doubts would creep in. Soon enough, she'd find herself isolated, unsure of who to trust. I watched the progression from a distance, the slow unraveling of the carefully constructed life she had built. It wasn't immediate. Emily was still holding things together, barely. But I could see the cracks widening. She'd come home later and later, her face drawn and exhausted. There were more whispered phone calls with Mark, more hurried conversations where I could hear the strain in her voice. She was turning to him for comfort, but even he was beginning to grow distant. I could see it in the way she talked about him, the increasing frustration in her voice. Their affair, once an escape for her, had become another source of stress. Mark wasn't the fantasy she had hoped for. He wasn't there to solve her problems or to be her escape from the chaos I had created. He was just another man, and now she had to manage him too. Still, I wasn't done. The next move was psychological. I began subtly altering things in the house, small, almost imperceptible changes that would make her question herself. I'd move her car keys to a different place, shift the position of her purse, rearrange a few items on her desk. She'd notice, of course, but she wouldn't be able to place the blame. I'd watch as she furrowed her brow, frustrated at herself for misplacing things she swore she'd left in one spot. I never offered an explanation, only mild concern. You've been so stressed lately, Emily. Maybe you just need to slow down. Her agitation grew with every small disruption. She started losing sleep, tossing and turning in bed, her mind undoubtedly racing with 100 little worries. She'd wake up early, her eyes red from lack of rest, and she'd say things like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I feel like I'm forgetting everything, like I'm losing my grip on things. I reassured her, played the role of the supportive husband to perfection, but inside I reveled in it. Every moment she questioned herself, every doubt that crept into her mind was a victory. Her professional life was crumbling too. After the missed email and the subsequent whisper campaign I'd started, her standing at work began to falter. Her boss, who had once trusted her implicitly, now started to question her decisions more often. She'd come home, her shoulders slumped, complaining about how she felt undermined at every turn. I knew it was only a matter of time before her reputation was beyond repair. Then came the confrontation with Mark. I hadn't anticipated it happening so soon, but Emily's growing paranoia had driven her to seek more from him than he was willing to give. She wanted reassurance, commitment, something real to cling to as her life spiraled. But Mark wasn't interested in being her savior. He'd enjoyed the affair when it was simple, when it was exciting. Now it was just another burden. Their relationship became strained, their conversations more clipped. I listened to their arguments through the phone, the tension palpable. One night, she came home after a particularly heated argument with him. Her face was flushed, her eyes red. She slammed the door, threw her purse onto the floor, and marched straight past me without a word. I followed her into the kitchen, watching as she opened a bottle of wine and poured herself a glass, her hands trembling. What's wrong? I asked, keeping my voice gentle, concerned. She didn't answer right away. She took a long drink, staring down at the counter. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. I don't know what's happening. Everything's falling apart. Work, my friends, even Mark. It's like, I don't know what to do anymore. I placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling her stiffen under my touch. You've been under a lot of pressure, I said softly. Maybe it's time to take a step back. Focus on what's important. She didn't respond, just stared at her glass as if it held the answer she was looking for. But there were no answers for her, not yet. Not until I was ready to give them to her. The next day, I escalated further. I made an anonymous complaint to her boss, citing her increasingly erratic behavior and concerns about her ability to manage her responsibilities. I knew the effect it would have. Her boss would have no choice but to address the issue, and in doing so, it would push Emily further into the corner I was building around her. The confrontation came sooner than I expected. She called me at work, her voice shaking, telling me she needed to talk. When I arrived home, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. They've put me on probation at work, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They said there have been too many mistakes, too many issues. I sat across from her, maintaining my calm exterior. What kind of mistakes? I asked, playing the part of the confused husband. She shook her head, running her hands through her hair. I don't know. I don't understand how this is happening. Everything is slipping out of control. I swear, I'm not losing it, but it feels like I am. I watched her closely, the way her hands trembled, the way her voice cracked with fear. It was working. Everything was working. Over the next few weeks, the pressure on her continued to build. Her boss was watching her closely. Her colleagues were distancing themselves, and Mark had pulled away entirely. Their relationship, once her escape from the mundanity of life, had become another source of anxiety. The few times she did see him, the conversations were short, tense, and unsatisfying. He was tired of the drama, tired of the weight she was placing on him. The day I knew she was nearing her breaking point came when she called me from her car. Her voice was small, panicked, and I could hear the tears in her throat. I can't, I can't do this anymore, she said. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I kept my voice calm, reassuring as I told her to come home to rest, to try to get some sleep. But I knew rest wouldn't come for her, not while her world was collapsing around her, and I wasn't done yet. The final steps were in motion now. I could feel it, the tension building like a slow, creeping fire. It was almost time to pull the last thread, to reveal everything and watch her world burn down to ashes. I wasn't finished yet. There were a few more moves left to make, a few more subtle sabotages to twist the knife further. But soon, very soon, she would know exactly what had happened to her. Emily's unraveling was nearing its peak, and the tension between us grew palpable. Though I maintained my facade of support and understanding, I could feel her slipping deeper into a world she couldn't control. I had become the master of subtlety. Each act of sabotage was small but significant, leaving her unable to determine why everything was falling apart. Now, her life was a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap under the growing weight of her professional failures, social isolation, and strained affair with Mark. It was only a matter of time. The escalation had been gradual but relentless. I had spread rumors about her to a select few of her friends, ensuring that doubts about her character and choices would seep into her social circle. Simple whispers, carefully planted in casual conversations, were all it took to turn long-standing friendships into tenuous connections. Her friends began to keep their distance, their interactions with her increasingly marked by a sense of quiet judgment. They questioned her, subtly at first, about her choices, her late nights, and her growing air of distraction. She'd confide in me about these tensions, her voice filled with confusion, unable to understand why her relationships were deteriorating. They just seemed different, she had said one night, sipping from a glass of wine after a failed attempt to reach out to an old friend. I don't know what's going on. Everyone's acting strange around me, like they know something I don't. I nodded sympathetically, placing a hand on hers and offered the expected platitudes. Maybe you're just stressed, I said softly. Sometimes people pick up on that. She shook her head, eyes unfocused. No, it's more than that. It's like they're avoiding me, like they don't trust me. I squeezed her hand, watching her from behind a mask of concern. I could see the strain in her eyes, the mounting paranoia. It wasn't just her friends. Her workplace had become hostile, her position now precarious. After my anonymous complaints to her boss, her superiors had begun monitoring her more closely, scrutinizing her every move. Every small mistake was amplified, every decision questioned. She was no longer the rising star they had once admired. Instead, she was a liability, distracted, unreliable, and in their eyes, unraveling. Her complaints to me became more frequent, her voice tinged with desperation. I don't know what's happening, she said one evening, pacing the living room. They're watching everything I do at work. It feels like they're just waiting for me to screw up. They probably just want to make sure you're focused, I replied calmly, feeding into her growing anxiety without offering a solution. Maybe you should take a step back. Get some distance. Emily stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing as she considered my words. You think I should, what, quit? Not quit, I said, keeping my tone measured. But maybe you're putting too much pressure on yourself. Maybe it's time to prioritize your mental health. She looked down, biting her lip. I could see the conflict in her. She didn't want to admit that she was losing control. She didn't want to acknowledge that her life was falling apart. But she was running out of options, and she knew it. Mark had already begun pulling away from her. Their affair had once been an exhilarating escape, but now it was another source of stress. Their arguments had become frequent, filled with tension and frustration. He wasn't willing to deal with the wreckage of her life. He had enjoyed the affair when it was convenient, but now that things were crumbling, he was backing off, distancing himself from the chaos. One night, after yet another terse phone call with him, she turned to me, her face pale and drawn. "It's over with, Mark," she said, her voice flat. He said he can't do this anymore." I pretended to be surprised. "What happened?" Emily shook her head, sinking into the couch. "I don't even know. Everything's just falling apart. He doesn't want to be a part of it anymore." I sat next to her, placing a comforting hand on her back, my mind quietly reveling in how perfectly everything was falling into place. "Maybe it's for the best," I said gently. "You need to focus on yourself." She nodded, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. This wasn't just about Mark. This was about everything. Her job was slipping away, her friends were distancing themselves. And now her affair, the one thing that had once made her feel alive, was over. She was losing everything, and I was the only constant in her life. The irony was almost poetic. With her personal and professional life crumbling, Emily became more and more dependent on me, clinging to the last semblance of stability. She'd sit with me in the evenings, her conversations a constant stream of worries, fears, and frustrations. She was desperate for answers, but none came. I played my part perfectly, always listening, always offering measured, supportive advice, all while knowing that her collapse was inevitable. The final act was approaching. I could feel it. Everything had been set in motion. The subtle sabotage, the psychological manipulation, the carefully planted doubts, all of it was leading to this moment. I had been waiting for the right time to pull the final thread, to reveal everything and watch her world fall apart completely. That moment came on a Friday evening when I suggested we host a small dinner with a few of her friends and colleagues. Emily was hesitant at first, worried about how strained her relationships had become, but I insisted. "It'll be good for you," I said, my voice soothing. "A chance to reconnect, to clear the air." Reluctantly, she agreed. The dinner was set for the following Saturday. I spent the week preparing meticulously, ensuring that everything was in place. The guest list was carefully curated, her closest friends, a few colleagues from work, and even Mark. I needed them all there. They needed to witness what was about to happen. On the night of the dinner, I could see the tension in Emily as she greeted her guests. Her smile was strained, her movements stiff. She was nervous, unsure of how her friends and colleagues would behave around her. I played the role of the perfect host, ensuring that everyone was comfortable, keeping the conversation light and friendly. But as the evening progressed, the atmosphere became more and more tense. I could see the sidelong glances, the whispers exchanged between her friends. Emily noticed too. She grew more anxious, her laughter becoming forced, her attempts at conversation faltering. It was then that I made my move. As we sat around the table, drinks in hand, I cleared my throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I wanted to say something," I began, my voice calm and steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be honest with the people you care about the importance of trust." Emily's eyes widened, her body tensing as she sensed something was wrong. "And I realized," I continued, "that there's been a lot of dishonesty in this room. Secrets. Lies." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily stared at me, her face pale, her lips parted in shock. What? What are you talking about?" I turned to her, meeting her gaze with a calm that belied the storm about to break. "I'm talking about you, Emily. I'm talking about your affair with Mark." A collective gasp echoed around the table. Mark, sitting on the other side, stiffened, his face draining of color. Emily's hands trembled, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "What are you doing?" she whispered. her voice barely audible. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote. With a press of a button, the screen in the corner of the room flickered to life. One by one, the messages between Emily and Mark appeared on the screen. Screenshots of their conversations, images of hotel receipts, emails exchanged in secret. Every piece of evidence I had meticulously collected over the past months was now on display for everyone to see. The room fell into stunned silence as Emily's affair was laid bare for all to witness. Her friends, her colleagues, and even Mark stared at the screen in shock. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if to steady herself. "This is insane," she whispered, shaking her head. "How did you—" "I've known for a long time, Emily," I said quietly, keeping my voice low and controlled. "I've known about everything. The late nights, the secret meetings, the lease. I've watched you dismantle our life piece by piece, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head, her voice trembling. "Please, don't do this, not like this." But it was already done. There was no stopping the avalanche now. Her friends looked away, some of them whispering among themselves, others glancing at Emily with a mixture of pity and disgust. Her colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure of how to react. And Mark. Mark was frozen in place, his face a mask of shock and fear. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. Emily's world had officially crumbled. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she turned to me, her face streaked with tears. "How could you do this?" she whispered, her voice broken. "How could you destroy everything?" I remained seated, watching her calmly. "I didn't destroy anything, Emily. You did." With that, I stood, walked past her, and left the room, leaving her to face the ruins of her life. The room was a vacuum of silence after my revelation. I could see the faces of her friends, her colleagues, and Mark, all staring at the screen, the messages, the receipts, each piece of evidence that I had meticulously gathered over the months. Emily's world was on full display, crumbling right before her eyes. No one spoke. The air was thick with shock, disgust, and disbelief. Emily's hands trembled, gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her voice, when it came, was thin, fragile. "Please, please, just stop." But I didn't stop. I stood there, calm, collected, and for the first time in months, I felt complete control. This was my moment. She was about to face the consequences of everything she had done. I had orchestrated every last detail leading up to this dinner, and now the climax was unfolding just as I had planned. I looked at her, but I didn't feel pity. I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of seeing my work come to fruition. "Stop," I repeated. "You want me to stop, Emily? After everything you've done? After months of lies? Do you even understand what you've destroyed?" Her eyes glistened with tears. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I cut her off, my voice rising for the first time. "You didn't mean to meet him in secret? You didn't mean to sneak off to hotels? You didn't mean to lie to me every single day?" The silence in the room was oppressive, but it was the weight of the truth, finally laid bare, that made it almost unbearable for her. Emily's face crumpled, and she slumped into her chair, head in her hands. The guests looked on, some avoiding eye contact, some staring in disbelief at the sheer magnitude of what had been revealed. I let the silence hang for a few more seconds before continuing, now lowering my voice to a steady, controlled tone. "I've known for months, Emily. I've known about you and Mark. I've known about your late-night texts, your little rendezvous. I've known about every single lie you've told me, and every time you looked me in the eye and thought you could get away with it." Emily sobbed quietly into her hands. I glanced around the room at the others. Some of her friends looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting toward the door as if they were contemplating an escape. Mark, however, was still sitting rigid, his face pale and his jaw tight. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word since everything came to light. He wasn't prepared for this. He hadn't expected me to go this far, to expose everything so publicly. He had likely believed that this was something that could be quietly swept under the rug, something Emily could manage on her own. He was wrong. I turned my gaze to him now, and for the first time that night, I addressed him directly. Mark, you must have known this would come out eventually, right? You didn't really think you could keep this a secret forever, did you? He swallowed hard, his voice barely audible when he finally spoke. I, I didn't, you didn't what? I interrupted, leaning forward slightly. You didn't think? You didn't care? You didn't think it was wrong? He didn't answer, his eyes shifting to Emily's crumpled form, as though searching for some way out of this. But there was no way out. This wasn't just about Emily. This was about him, too. And I wanted him to feel it, to feel every inch of the humiliation, every ounce of the shame that Emily was experiencing. I stepped back, surveying the room. You all know what she did now. You all know the lies, the betrayal. This is who she really is. Another wave of silence settled over the group. I could see the judgment on their faces, the way some of them recoiled at Emily, while others simply looked away, embarrassed for her. This was it, the unraveling I had worked so meticulously to create. Emily finally lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale and stricken. I'm sorry, she whispered. Please, I'm so sorry. But the words didn't have the weight they should have. They came too late, and they were aimed at the wrong person. It wasn't just me she needed to apologize to. It was herself. Her friends, her colleagues, everyone in that room, really. And it was clear from the looks on their faces that no one was in the mood to forgive her now. I turned and left the room, walking out the front door without looking back. I heard nothing as I left, only the low murmur of voices behind me, muted by the door as it clicked shut. Outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I took a deep breath. I should have felt something, victory, relief, something, but I didn't, not yet. The feeling of control was still there, but it was hollow, like the aftermath of a battle where I had won, but at a cost I wasn't ready to fully comprehend. I walked down the street, the night quiet around me, the echo of my own footsteps the only sound I could focus on. My mind should have been racing with everything that had just transpired, but all I could think about was the silence, the utter stillness that now surrounded me. When I reached the park at the end of the street, I sat down on one of the benches. I stared out into the dark, listening to the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I had done it. Everything I had set out to do, I had accomplished. I had exposed Emily for what she was. I had torn down the facade she had so carefully built. I had destroyed the life she had taken for granted. But why didn't it feel like enough? I sat there for what felt like hours, the quiet pressing in on me. For months, I had focused on this one thing, my revenge. My plan had been flawless. I had controlled every aspect of her life, manipulated every situation, orchestrated every detail. And yet, now that it was over, now that I had won, I felt empty. I had spent so long planning and calculating that I hadn't stopped to think about what came after. I hadn't considered what my life would look like once everything was laid bare, once I had burned it all down. I thought back to the moment I had discovered the receipt, to the way I had felt that first sharp stab of betrayal. It had driven me, focused me. But now that the betrayal was out in the open, now that it was over, I realized that nothing had truly changed for me. I was still sitting here alone, in the dark. I thought about Emily, still inside that room, surrounded by the ruins of her life. She had lost everything, her friends, her reputation, her career. And I had orchestrated all of it. But at what cost? I wasn't sure anymore. I stood up slowly, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I had regained control, just as I had set out to do. But there was no satisfaction in it, no peace. Just the realization that I had lost something too, something I hadn't expected to lose, myself. As I walked home, the streets empty around me, I wondered if Emily felt the same way. If, in those moments when her world had come crashing down, she had realized that the person she had betrayed the most was herself. That the lies she had told, the life she had built on deceit, had all been for nothing in the end. When I reached the front door, I paused, my hand on the handle. Inside, the house was dark and still. empty, just like I felt. I turned the handle and stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. It was over now. Everything was over. And yet the silence remained. The house was empty, just as I'd left it that night. After the dinner, I hadn't returned immediately. I'd needed space from Emily, from the wreckage of our marriage, and from everything I had carefully dismantled. The silence now felt oppressive, a reminder of what I'd orchestrated. The quiet echoed in every room, each corner steeped in the remnants of a life that had crumbled under the weight of deceit. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, like something unfinished still lingered. I sat in the living room, staring at the space Emily used to occupy. I'd spent months planning every aspect of my revenge, controlling each step with precision. The meticulousness of it all, the cold logic had fueled me. But now, as I sat here alone, the victory felt hollow. Emily was gone, emotionally, mentally, and perhaps soon physically too. I had broken her, as I intended, but I hadn't considered what would be left for me. I replayed the moments of her downfall in my mind, each scene vivid. Her expression when I revealed her affair, the way her shoulders slumped in defeat when everyone saw the messages, and the desperate way she had looked at me, silently pleading for an explanation she already knew. I'd taken everything from her, as she had done to me, but in the aftermath, I realized I had lost something too. My thoughts drifted to what she might be doing now. Emily had retreated into isolation, likely facing the consequences of her actions alone. Her friends wouldn't offer comfort. They had witnessed her betrayal. Her colleagues, her professional world, had collapsed in the wake of my carefully placed complaints and sabotage. And Mark? He'd abandoned her, as I had anticipated. He wasn't the type to stick around for the fallout. Emily was left with nothing. But wasn't that the point? I had wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal. I wanted her to experience the full spectrum of guilt, shame, and loss. And she had. The revenge had been exact, calculated, and executed flawlessly. But as I sat in the dark, the realization that my life too was empty settled deep into my bones. I thought back to who I had been before I discovered her affair. There was a time when I was content, or at least I believed I was. We had shared years of routine, of seemingly perfect harmony. I had trusted her. And then, when I found that hotel receipt, that world shattered. My trust was the first thing to go, but it had been quickly followed by the version of myself that believed in the simplicity of love, of marriage. I had become someone else, someone driven by the need to control, to reclaim power. But now that I had it, I didn't recognize what was left. Was this all there was? I'd taken everything from Emily, but I hadn't prepared for the aftermath. The cold calculation that had driven me forward had left me with nothing but an empty house, a shattered marriage, and a hollow sense of victory. I stood up, walking slowly through the house, passing by the rooms that were once ours. The bedroom, where we had shared so many nights, now felt foreign. Her presence lingered faintly, but it wasn't comforting. It was a reminder of the distance that had grown between us long before her affair had begun. I wondered not for the first time if I had pushed her into Mark's arms, if my emotional detachment had been the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. But no, I wouldn't allow myself to believe that. This wasn't my fault. I had been wrong, betrayed. Emily had made her choices. And yet, as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I had lost something more valuable than just my wife. Maybe I had lost myself. I had always prided myself on control, on being the one who could navigate any situation with calmness and precision. But the man I had become, the one who had orchestrated this downfall, was a stranger to me. I had always thought revenge would feel satisfying, that once I had torn her world apart, I would feel a sense of closure. But all I felt now was emptiness. I walked to the window, looking out into the night. The street was quiet, just as it had been that night when I left the dinner. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. I wondered if Emily had already packed her things, if she was planning to leave without a word. She had no reason to stay now. There was nothing left for her here, just as there was nothing left for me. In the end, what had I really achieved? I had regained control, yes, but at what cost? I had no one to share it with, no one to witness my triumph. Emily's life had been dismantled, but mine was just as fractured. I had spent so long focused on revenge that I hadn't considered what life would look like once it was done. And now, standing here alone, I realized that I had been chasing an illusion. The house felt suffocating now, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. I needed to get out, to clear my head, but even that felt futile. There was no escape from this. I had done what I set out to do, but it hadn't brought the peace I had expected. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, but it didn't bring relief. I stood there for a long moment, looking out at the street, the empty houses, the quiet night. I had everything I thought I wanted, but it had come at a price I hadn't fully understood until now. Control, power, revenge. I had gained it all, but I had lost something far more important along the way.